Hello and welcome to Representative Gary Glenn Reports. I'm John Perry and I'm joined by Representative Gary Glenn.
John,
Representative,
good to see you,
good
sir.
to see you. Haven't seen you for about 3 months, and I suppose it begs the question, how are you feeling?
Well, I am feeling remarkably better. I had my last chemotherapy treatment on July 28th, so that terrible feeling that was associated with that treatment is gone. Woke up one day last week and thought to myself, I feel normal. I've put on an additional 40 pounds from all the treatment, the steroids and all of that. So I've got to get rid of that in order to feel normal the way I'm used to. But my wife and I are walking over a mile every other night or so, jogging a couple of 100 yards. I've done 3 physical therapy treatments so far, and the lady's starting to push me a little bit with squats and leg presses. So getting back in shape. The doctors tell me the cancer is gone. It's undetectable. The PSA count was 348 when I was diagnosed. It's less than 0.1 now. Later this week, or next week, I'm going to be going at Bullitt Creek High School to hear the cancer doctor from the University of Michigan Cancer Center, who's a doctor originally from Midland, who's going to be speaking specifically about prostate cancer. And Mid-Michigan Medical Center is raising money to get some new equipment that will allow them to diagnose and treat prostate cancer more quickly. But I'm hopeful from this experience, and I know it's already been the case with one of my colleagues in the legislature who, because of my experience, went and got tested and was diagnosed as having prostate cancer just in the last 2 or 3 months. Thankfully, his was contained in the prostate. Looks like they'll be able to have surgery and have that taken care of. But my experience was not pleasant, but was miraculous on so many levels. To go from 348 to less than 0.1, I've probably got the best PSA score in the building, and to have the vertebrae in my spinal column that had been destroyed by the cancer replace itself, or as the doctors say, remodel itself. The neurosurgeon in Midland had thought he was going to have to put a titanium cage in my spinal column, but it remodeled, came out of nothing, and recreated itself, so it's healed without surgery. And I've been cleared to resume normal activity. I'm getting back out there, and as I always make the point, John, throughout this treatment, radiation and chemotherapy, I maintained a perfect attendance record, did not miss any votes, didn't miss any committee meetings. And so I've been faithful to the job the people of Bay and Midland County sent me down here to do, even in the face of some pretty dramatic health challenges.
Those treatments, after all, can be pretty punishing.
They can be punishing, and I am very grateful to my wife, who drove me when I wasn't up to driving, without her committing her time to get me to Lansing back during those chemo treatments over the last 5 or 6 months. I don't know if I'd have been able to get down here, but she was kind enough to do that. She has a sense of public service as well, not just faithfulness to me, but to the job that I signed up to do. And so I'm very happy to have come out the other end and be told by the University of Michigan that the cancer's gone and the chemo is over, and I'm starting to feel great, feel back to normal. So was able to keep doing the job even in the midst of it, but now that that's behind me, I'm raring to get back at it, as we're going to do here for the next several weeks in Lansing.
Representative, it's fall. It is back to school time, and actually you're working on some legislation now dealing with education in a couple of different realms. One revolves around some of the sickouts, in particular the sickouts that we saw in the Detroit public schools in the last school year.
Right.
Looking at some court rulings, I would think you would argue there needs to be a change in the law.
I've got a couple of pieces of legislation this fall that will address the situation in Detroit, because I think that when taxpayers across the entire state are expected to make up some of the deficiencies, which as a constitutional duty we are in fact required to do, that they expect the Detroit school system to perform at least at some minimum level of competence. And so in this particular one of the bills is it is currently against the law for teachers to strike, for public school teachers to strike. And as our viewers probably remember, when we were debating the Detroit public school situation about 3 months ago, teachers were having these sickouts where, in collusion with other teachers, obviously, without the permission of the Detroit public school administrators, they didn't show up for work. expected to be paid, of course, but didn't show up for work. And who's hurt by that? Detroit public school students. And we already have a law that says strikes are illegal. But a liberal judge down in Detroit ruled that because the current state strike law says that the absence from work in collusion with other teachers without the permission of the supervisors has to be for the purposes of affecting work conditions. This judge issued a convoluted ruling that said that it had nothing to do with their work conditions, and therefore the current strike law doesn't apply. Well, my legislation would simply strike the language that says that the in collusion absence without the permission of the principals and superintendent is a strike regardless of what its purpose was. So I think that was the clear intent of the law. But if a judge can't figure that out down in Detroit, then we can clarify the law by simply saying if you're not on the job, if you're not teaching children, and it's in collusion with other teachers and there's a bunch of you doing it and you don't have the permission of the principal or the school superintendent, that's a strike. It's against the law, ought to be enforced. Another piece of legislation, we heard complaints from some that we were saying that Detroit public schools, in the bill that passed several months ago, could hire qualified, non-certified teachers. And there were complaints that Detroit was being treated differently than school districts in the rest of the state. Well, I agree with that point. I think all school districts should be free to judge the qualifications of the people they hire to teach. And for example, in my community, if a retired Dow chemist, out of a sense of paying back to the community, went to Midland High or Dow High or over in Auburn or Pinconning or Meridian schools and said, as a way of giving back, I volunteer to teach chemistry to 10th or 11th graders in the high school. The local superintendent and principal ought to be free to hire that Dow chemist or let him come in and teach for free, whether he's got a teacher's certificate or not. That doesn't mean he just has to have knowledge on the subject matter. He also has to be judged by the superintendent, the principal, of being capable of effectively teaching it to young people. But if the local school officials make that judgment, who am I, who's the state government, to say that we know better than our local school officials? I think all Michigan school districts should be free to hire qualified, non-certified teachers. So I've introduced a bill to take the exact same language that allowed Detroit public schools to do that and apply it to every school district in the state. Because I agree, every school district should be free to hire the best qualified teachers in the estimation of local school districts without the state government's interference.
Would you argue too, Representative, that there does need to be more focus on the kids, whether it's having a teacher in the classroom to begin with, whether it's having a skilled individual in the classroom? The focus needs to be on the students.
Well, obviously in regards to the strike law, we want a teacher in the classroom, period. Because if they're not teaching the kids, it's not doing the kids any good. There was that infamous quote by the National Education Association official here within the last several years where they said, you know, we're not interested in the well-being of children. Our interest is in the working conditions and salaries of our union members. I don't think that's the priority scale that parents expect. Certainly not one that I as a legislator expect. So yes, we want them at least in the classroom. And it's already illegal if they're not, as in collusion with other teachers. But it ought to also be left up to local school officials to judge the qualifications of people they think are qualified to teach. And I don't see how you could have Superintendent Mike Sharrow finds a retired Dow chemist who can teach the subject matter, and Mike Sharrow thinks they can do it effectively, and we're going to have a state law that says, Mike, we know better than you do. That person should not be allowed to teach, even if they're doing it as a public service, even if it would save the school district money that could be spent better to educate our children. I'm also optimistic that in the next budget year, we've come very close the last two budget years, but I'm optimistic that in the next budget year, in the next legislature, that we're going to be able to get legislation passed so that the at-risk money that is allocated for schools will follow the child and not be divvied up based on what percentage of students in a given school district are at risk. 1 out of 4 children in the Midland Public School District, one of the more affluent ones in the state, is considered to be at risk, and yet none of the at-risk money goes to Midland. It was appropriated in this year's budget, but came out when we found we were about $300 million short on revenue estimates. But in a normal year where we don't have those kind of emergency cuts, I think we can establish the principle, as Jerry Wasserman expressed it to me, that the money should follow the child, not the school district. So I am focusing on school reform legislation that I think will be good, not just for the students in Bay and Midland counties, but for every student throughout Michigan.
Speaking of education, Representative, we've talked a lot about energy policy reform in the year and a half you've been here. Obviously, there is a school component, an education component to the debate that has been going on in Lansing. So when it comes to that issue, to schools being able to have some choice in the energy they buy, are we, in your mind, maybe going to see some sort of movement between now and the end of the year?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. After having been back in Lansing now 2 days, my early read is that I think it's likely nothing is going to move in terms of energy reform legislation, which is pretty remarkable. When I took office in January of 2015, we were told this is going to be on the governor's desk by June 1st of 2015. Well, it still hasn't moved beyond committee in either house, despite the two big utilities spending $7.4 million on what I consider to be misleading advertising, scare tactics. They went from predicting brownouts to now they're saying blackouts. Nothing of the kind is anywhere near in the future. In fact, the big consortium that handles electricity allocation throughout the Midwest, their projections have increased to the positive in terms of Michigan's capacity since we came into office in January of 2015. And yet the predictions by the utilities have gotten more dire, even though the projections for capacity have gotten more positive. I thought it was telling several months ago when UBS, United Banking Systems, I think that stands for, which is a marketing firm that sells the utility stock for consumers and Detroit Edison, they, under threat of penalty from the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, were honestly telling their potential stockholders, people who might buy DTE and consumer stock, that this legislation, if passed, would eliminate electricity choice, would have that practical effect. So there's no legal penalty for a lobbyist or a fellow legislator telling us they're keeping electricity choice for schools and everybody else. But the SEC would penalize UBS for selling stock with that claim. So instead, UBS had to be honest and say that in fact it would eliminate electricity choice. That would mean for 40% of our public schools in Michigan, their electricity bill is going to go up. Bay City schools, Bay City Western's in my district in Auburn, they save $200,000 a year by buying their electricity from somebody other than consumers, but under this unjustifiable barrier to individual freedom on the part of school districts, Meridian schools, Pinconning schools, Midland schools are prohibited from buying their electricity from anybody other than consumers. And similarly, Saginaw Valley State saves $200,000 a year, but Northwood and Delta College, where my youngest son has just started this past week, they're prohibited by law from having the same kind of savings. Doesn't make sense to me. We ought to allow everybody to choose in a free and open market. That gives us better product, better price, better service. But at minimum, if we can't get that far, if there aren't enough votes for that, I've introduced legislation to say at least every school district, every college and university, every local government, Oakland County saves $500,000 a year for Oakland County taxpayers because they buy electricity from somebody other than DTE. Midland County, Bay County can't do that. Right? Actually, I think Bay does, but Midland County is prohibited by law from doing so. So that issue is now before us. You hear it in the news reports that that's one of the big issues we're going to try to address in the 20-some legislative days remaining. But honestly, I'm hopeful we'll just simply run out the clock. Better we do nothing than do something that would harm Michigan.
So we're talking about long-term implications here, aren't we?
And honestly, I would rather take that issue and hold it over till the next legislative session. We'll reshuffle the deck. You're going to have a whole lot of new legislators coming in, and I'd rather take that issue up next year. We've got plenty of time. There's no emergency, no blackouts coming, as these misleading ads have told people, to the tune of $7.4 million. And you've worked around here, John. I mean, for an entity, for a lobbying group to spend $7.4 million, and at least, knock on wood, so far, we've been able to block the monopoly legislation that they're trying to pass to do away with competition is pretty remarkable. I guess I would characterize that as here we are in September of 2016. Over the last 20 months of my service in the Michigan legislature, I would characterize that as perhaps my most significant accomplishment. It was the major basis on which one of the local news services named me the freshman legislator of the year, not for what I had done, but what I had prevented from having happen, and that is to have legislation passed that would remonopolize Michigan's entire electricity market, drive up electricity rates for 40% of our public schools, and hurt Michigan's economy. It's the single biggest expense of doing business for Dow Chemical and Dow Corning and Hemlock Semiconductors. And so it's a big deal to people in my district and major employers, but just as a matter of principle, people should be free to choose from competing providers and get the best product at the best price for electricity, just like we know that applies to everything else in life.
Representative, we're going to take a break right now,
Okay.
but we'll be back with Representative Gary Glenn Reports right after this. And we're back with Representative Gary Glenn Reports. Representative, I know you have been very busy in the district, meeting with local elected officials.
I typically would keep an even more aggressive pace, John, but the first part of the summer I was still going under the chemotherapy and wasn't up to a lot, didn't have a lot of energy. But as I got to feeling better, just to give you an example, on one Monday evening, I went to Garfield Township's board meeting, and then Beaver Township's board meeting, and then Auburn City Commission meeting, all in the same night, one right after the other. And the next night I went to the Lincoln and Larkin Township board meetings, and then the next night I went to the Midland County Township board meeting, and also went to the quarterly meeting of all the township officials in Midland County and spoke to them. And then Senator Jim Stamas and I recently had the pleasure of meeting with Mayor Docker and the Midland City Council to talk about some issues that the city of Midland is confronting. In particular, the unfunded liability for pensions, which is when I did the Midland City Academy a couple of years ago, when I was running for this position, I remember being extremely surprised that in a relatively small community and conservatively governed community, we still have, I believe, $40 million in unfunded liability for city employees. Things are changing to where people are being moved from a defined benefit to a defined contribution pension plan, but this is the unfunded liability for those who no longer work for the city, who are retirees. And when the city of Midland has that large of an unfunded liability, it makes it easy to understand why the United States of America is looking at over 100 trillion.
You can extrapolate out from that,
something
sure.
like that. So it was a disturbing discovery on my part. And it's something that city officials are grappling with. And I know Senator Stamas and I were certainly open to any way we can help the city come to some kind of conclusion about the unfunded liability. But that was certainly a good opportunity. I've had a number of occasions I shared with them in encouraging them to be in touch with me on any issue that directly affected the city. And there was one example when the superintendent of the Bullock Creek School District happened to send me an email a day that a bill coming through was going to require this new reporting requirement on the finances of every public school district. It was aimed at school districts like Detroit and Pontiac that were not being managed appropriately and responsibly. But it was going to be a new reporting requirement on every school district, including those who had been managed responsibly. Charlie sent me an email. I called him on the phone, and on the fly, on the phone, with the superintendent of Bullock Creek Schools, we amended the bill so that if you had an 8% financial reserve, you didn't have to comply with this new reporting requirement. If you'd responsibly manage your finances such that you had not just everything you needed to pay the bills, but an 8% reserve. And that ended up exempting every school district in Midland County, for example. So the legislation was changed. It wouldn't have been changed that way except for that email. from the superintendent of Bullitt Creek Schools. So that was the example I shared with Mayor Donker and the City Council, where if they'll call me, we go through so much legislation in a day, as you know, John, that unless something makes you pay attention to a particular bill, and it would have just been another in the flurry of bills being dealt with that day, but Charlie's email got my attention, and we changed the bill as a result. So it's extremely important for our local officials to let me know when I can be of help. I have found one principle is certain in this job. I don't have to be an expert on everything, on hundreds of pieces of legislation, as long as I have access to experts. And I know you want to talk about the two experts I was privileged to host today. The House every September 11th or nearby, and that was today on Thursday, we had a 9/11 memorial service to honor first responders, to honor members of the military, fire and police, paramedics who've lost their lives in the last year. We do that right around 9/11 every year. And during that ceremony, we host first responders from our communities. So it was my privilege today to host in Lansing at the State House of Representatives, Lisa Hall, who is the Midland County 9/11 Dispatch Director, and Chris Isworski, who is the Bay County 9/11 Director, who lives in Auburn, which is the portion of Bay County that is in the district that I represent. Lisa was able to join me on the floor for the ceremonies. I certainly got the impression from her comments that she was moved by it, felt privileged to be there. It was my privilege to host her. And then we went out to lunch afterwards, and I learned more about dispatch and the 9/11 system over lunch than I've ever learned before. And I think they are, we always hear the talk about members of the military, which is appropriate, obviously, that protect us on a national level, our first responders, fire and police and paramedics. But the fire and police and paramedics don't respond unless 9/11, the dispatch office, tells them what's up and where they need to go. So they're kind of a lost part, perhaps, of the chain, but a very important one. And last year I had Fire Chief Chris Coughlin and one of his deputy chiefs in. But this year I thought, let's shine the spotlight on the folks that are on the other end of the line when we need help and call 911. I remember also being surprised in the Midland Citizens Academy when we toured 911. I guess I was expecting a far more technologically advanced system. But as they explained to me, they're still using 1950s technology. And we might assume that they can place where a call's coming from now with GPS capabilities. They can't, because GPS is not part of the system. So they are hopeful that we will move toward a more futuristic type 9/11 system, just using current technology that is available to us, so that if you were in a multi-story building, they'd know what floor you're on. They could pinpoint your position. If you're not physically able because of your condition, to tell them exactly where you are. I think maybe a lot of people, myself included, assumed that was the case with today's technology. They tell me it's not. So that's one of the concerns that they were expressing. But I appreciate Chris from Bay County and Lisa from Midland County and the work that they do, and appreciate the time they took over lunch to educate me so that I can make a more informed analysis and decision on legislation regarding dispatch.
And our representative, sometimes when we talk about state government, there's maybe sort of an alphabet soup that comes with it, AFP, NFIB. But these are all organizations that keep a close eye on what's going on in our state government, and they were honoring you over the last few months.
Well, I got a 100% score from the National Federation of Independent Business, the Michigan chapter, unbeknownst to me. I mean, I just vote the way I hope is right and represents the concerns of people in Bay and Midland counties. But various organizations rank your voting record, and the National Federation of Independent Business, made up of small business owners who supply most of the new jobs in our economy, they ranked me at 100%, that I had voted consistent with their position 100% of the time. Americans for Prosperity is another free market, free enterprise type group, and they ranked me in the last several months as being 100% in agreement with their stand on various issues, economic issues and growth issues. One of my focuses has been, I was very proud to play a role in Michigan's passage of a right-to-work bill, that as a result of that, not only are individuals now free to choose whether to join or pay dues to a union, but our economy has expanded. We've been one of the national leaders in job creation. We're ahead of the national average on wage growth after passing right to work. But I've been in pursuit of what's next. What's the next big thing that will help bring jobs and economic opportunity to families across Michigan? I think having cheaper electricity is one of those things. But across the board, NFIB and Americans for Prosperity measure those types of issues. What is going to result in job creation and economic activity and economic growth? So I'm happy on behalf of the people of Bay and Midland counties to have accumulated a record, perfect attendance, but 100% with NFIB and Americans for Prosperity. Inside Michigan politics is also another score that's, and just this week they issued their ranking of Michigan legislators, and I was tied for second, only one vote difference for the most conservative member of the State House of Representatives. So I gave due deference to Representative Lana Tice, who was the most conservative. I guess she was one more correct on their scale than Lee Chatfield and I were. We tied for second. Lana and I were the only two members of the legislature that got a 100% score from Americans for Prosperity. But I believe the people of Midland and Bay counties want me to be a conservative voice in Lansing. My predecessors, John Molinar and Tony Stamas, during their service in the House, were also honored as having the most conservative voting records. So I'm following in good footsteps and maintaining a tradition of representing Midland and part of Bay counties in a conservative fashion. And yet I would note that I have been praised on several occasions by Democrats for my willingness to work across the aisle, be cooperative, come up with bipartisan solutions for Michigan's future. One very prominent Democrat in Midland County wrote in the newspaper that I was the only elected official who had kept my promise to meet regularly, monthly, with my constituents. So that was high praise coming from somebody who's typically a critic on where I stand on the issues, but he wrote that he respected my convictions and was thankful that I'd kept my promise to be available and transparent and available to the public. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm going to apply my conservative principles. I'm going to do it in such a way, especially if I've had the opportunity on the energy issue to work cooperatively with Democrat members of the legislature. And I'm also a co-sponsor of the package, the bipartisan package, to allow citizens and the media to make FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests of the governor's office and the legislature, which is not now the case. So I'm hopeful to see that legislation move too. But I'm going to continue to be a conservative and vote that way, but open-minded and willing to work with anybody on either side of the aisle of either party as a matter of principle to do what's best, we hope, for the people of Midland and Michigan and all of Michigan, Bay and Midland counties.
And to close, if people have a question, a comment, give your office a call, drop you an email. Obviously, you're in the district.
We'll put all that stuff on the screen, all the different ways you can get in touch with me. And my chief of staff is former Senator and Representative Mike Gashka. He's got a lot of experience. I am rarely in the office. When we're in Lansing, I'm in committee meetings, on the floor, working with other legislators. We're not just sitting around twiddling our thumbs, sitting in the office. So your first point of contact is going to be Jordan Kaiser in my office and my chief of staff, Mike Gashka, who has 14 years of experience. And certainly I'm willing to meet with people individually or in a group upon request, and look forward to seeing people as we now get into the fall season, football season. We were out at Midland High Football Stadium just the other night for a community-wide prayer meeting, back-to-school prayer meeting, prayed for our elementary kids, our middle school kids, our high school kids, our college kids, the administrators, the teachers. And my wife Annette and I had the privilege of sitting down next to Congressman Molinar and his wife. And so when we broke up into small prayer groups, it was Congressman Molinar and Amy and my wife Annette and me. And it was really a great experience. And then they were kind enough to stay and walk 5 laps with Annette and me afterwards as I'm trying to get back in shape after this latest little health complication. So a very good opportunity to think about the well-being of our children in our community. I have the privilege of representing some great communities, and one of my close friends told me 2 years ago that my first responsibility was to protect the special quality of life that we have in Bay and Midland counties, and that has stuck with me and has led the way that I voted in the House of Representatives.
Gary Glenn, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
And thank you for joining us.